Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of aggregate planning in goods and services. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by aggregate planning in goods and services, what are the various activities that have been undertaken in aggregate planning in goods and services, and what are the various activities that have been taken for the day-to-day operation of those activities. Let us understand what do we mean by aggregate planning in goods and services. For an effective production activity, it is necessary to see that the success rate of the organization is continuously improving and accordingly the benefit is being created in the long term. So the organizational operations department has to always see that whatever amount of goods and services that are needed to be manufactured are effectively available and those particular goods and services are utilized in an effective way. So the effective operational plan is being required or is necessary to see that how the operational activities are being conducted. The product design and the production management approach is one of the most important aspects of the production plan. So in order to be a production plan in an effective way, we have to see that we must have a product planning approach and the product design must be quite effective. When the product design is quite effective, then accordingly, the goods and services that have been manufactured are also very effective, qualitative, and accordingly for those particular concern, the aggregate or the wholesome planning is essentially required. These particular activity are being conducted in a certain assembly line. That is, when you implement these particular activities on the shop floor, so for those particular concerns, the activity that is being required is with respect majorly focusing on the materials. When we say that materials is into existence, the material requirement planning or manufacturing resource planning is essentially important, which deals with the architecture of your shop floor, wherein in what way the methods or the processes have been undertaken for movement of goods and services from one location to another location. And for those particular concerns, the aggregate planning is essentially required. Now let's understand what are the various factors that affect the aggregate planning. The first factor that affects the aggregate planning is the available production facility and raw material. So, being the basic essential requirement or need, it is necessary to see that the production facility are quite available into the market and accordingly the facilities of availability of raw material, purchase of goods and services and is quite sufficient. A reliable demand production for the medium term is available. Estimation of demand is equally important and whenever the demand is being projected, it is being identified. At all the stages, the demand needs to be there in a controlled position and accordingly, the forecasting or prediction as to what will be the demand for a product always needs to be ascertained and needs to be determined. Financial planning with respect to the cost, the availability of raw material, increase or decrease in the price of a certain commodity, the control on the cost with respect to the operating cost, non-operating cost, durable and non-durable cost, the cost of labor, the cost of inventory, and so on. So the factors with respect to the costing of the finance department also needs to be there in a controlled way and accordingly it directly impacts the aggregate planning. Organizational policies with respect to the organizational behavior, the human resource employment, the planning with respect to the inventory, the planning with respect to the human resource, certain tools, techniques, training and development strategies that are needed to be implemented, and so on. So the labor management techniques needs to be very effective, and it is to be seen that all those activities are being conducted in a very effective way to increase the productivity or skill of the employees. Now let's understand what are the various inputs that have been required for aggregate planning in goods and services. A projection of total demand for the time period. So when we say that a projection activity is needed to be undertaken, the aggregate planning requires the projection of the demand for a certain product. So within a specified time period, what will be the demand for a certain product, whether the demand will be met or not met, and what should be the availability of material for fulfilling those particular demand. Evaluation of all the possible capacity planning tools such as subcontracting, outsourcing, and so on needs to be applied, and one has to see that if it has been observed that the sufficient demand will not be fulfilled in the specified time period, then for those particular concern, necessary revisions in the aggregate plan is required to be implemented. Wherein if the demand either increases or if the demand either decreases, then accordingly the company's policy should be flexible and should be in a certain operating mode which can be changed at any point of time. The current operational state of workers, such as the numbers, the skill sets, the inventory level, the production efficiency, should be there in a controlled way. And when those particular inputs are being provided very effectively and efficiently, only then the operational activities can be conducted effectively. The aggregate planning ensures that an organizational labor, inventory, and production are being there in a controlled way or in a planned way. So, before actual starting of production of goods and services, we have to see that there is a proper planning into existence. And when the planning is been implemented or created for all the departments, then accordingly it is called as an aggregate planning. Aggregate planning is a composition of plan for all the departments which are into existence. May it be the operations, may it be the inventory, may it be the stores, may it be the shop floor, may it be finance, may it be marketing, and so on. Now, how does aggregate planning acts as an operational tool in the organization? The aggregate planning aids in achieving a balance between organizational, operational, financial, and overall strategic goal. The strategic goal, which aims to increase either the vision, mission, and policy statement, the control on the long-term and short-term objectives, achievement of the objectives of the either profit maximization and wealth maximization. All those activities are needed to be there in an effective way, and such activities are needed to be controlled as and when it is being required. The concept of aggregate planning acts as a monetary system for capacity as well as demand forecasting. So, estimation and forecasting of demand is easily available, or it can be done very easily with the help of forecasting or aggregate planning into existence, which creates a certain monitoring tool and a system about how the product can be established, how the production activity can be undertaken, and how the demand of the particular product can be fulfilled. A business always strives to drive the balance between the capacity, the price, the marketing, order management, and so on. So, in order to maintain the balance between all these particular factors, effective and a foolproof aggregate planning is essentially required. So, it acts as an operating tool to see that all the activities are being conducted in an effective way. There is an involvement or the aids for all the departments, and the cost is also being minimized with respect to an effective forecasting, demand forecasting policy into existence. Now let's understand what the various resources planning that are into existence. The resources planning that is being required may be either adequate or inadequate at any place or point of time. So for those particular concern, one has to see, and they have to take a precaution measure as to availability of resources at every stage and point of time. The demand for a certain product may increase or may decrease as and when there is a change in the market conditions. So with the changes in the market conditions, if there is a fluctuation in the demand for a certain product, then accordingly the manufacturing policy also needs to be revised. By including the overtime as a part of the schedule, more capacity is being created. So in order to increase the capacity for a certain product, one has to see that the product that is being created or it is being manufactured, it creates a certain position as to including the overtime production for a certain machinery. So effective and optimum utilization of the resources, the capacity of a machinery, capacity of the labor, everything is being utilized, and accordingly the task is being completed in a specified time period. Now, another planning with respect to the aggregate planning is the concept of use of labor management. Whenever, if there is a certain concern of hiring a certain people for a short-term period, then accordingly the labor must be hired and the job must be completed within the specified time period. So, increase or decrease in the labor availability with respect to the changes or availability in technology, the cost factors, the marketing factors, and the operational tools and techniques, the labor numbers should be either increased or it should be either decreased. Now let's understand what is the importance of aggregate planning. Aggregate planning helps to increase the bottom line through lowering the total variable cost and achieving the financial goals. So the financial goals of the organization are easily achieved with the help of lowering the total variance cost. The variance or the overheads which have been associated with the manufacturing or the production department can be controlled with the bottom line approach. That is, controlling all the activities at the shop floor level, and in return, this will be providing a fruitful combination or a fruitful results to the further departments. Maximizing the use of available production capacity. The production capacity that demand possesses, all those capacity should be utilized at full level, and accordingly one has to see that there is no ideal time which has been there into existence. So Ultimately, when the product is more qualitative and delivered to the customer in the specified time period, then accordingly we create a customer happiness by matching the demand with the supply available of goods into the market. Reducing the amount of money you spend on inventory storage. So the amount of money that has been spent on the storage as a part of a concern always gets reduced with the help of inventory or aggregate planning into existence. So aggregate planning being dealing with all the departments, that is inventory, stores, purchases, manufacturing, supply chain, distribution, marketing, finance, labor management, and so on. It deals with or try to save the amount of inventory reduction. It is also looking for accomplishment of the scheduled goals, resulting in the contented and happy workforce. So the workforce who is employed in the organization is also quite happy, and they are also satisfied with respect to the availability of resources in the organization. Now let's look at the various strategies that are applicable for aggregate planning. There are three levels of strategy at the stage of aggregate planning. Number one, the level strategy. Number two, the chase strategy. And number three, the hybrid strategy. Hybrid strategy is a combination of the level strategy and the chase strategy. Level strategy is being implemented at each and every individual level, may it be at the lower level, at the top level, or at the middle level management. Chase strategy is a contradictory between the level strategy, wherein as and when it is been required, it may be either implemented or it may be either changed or it may be either revised. The combination of the level and chase strategy is the hybrid strategy. So now in this particular session, we have understood that the aggregate planning is essentially important or it is essentially required. So for consideration the common problems of all the departments, in order to see that the production activity is being conducted very effectively, there is a proper balance between the demand and supply of the products and services. It is necessary to see that there is aggregate planning into existence. Matching the demand and supply factors is essentially important because ultimately the production will and activity will be undertaken based on the demand which is there from the market, and the supply of the goods and services will be only made only when there is effective or maximum production in on the shop floor. The factors with respect to the inventory, plant layout, resource allocation, mobility, stock level, and so on always needs to be maintained in a balanced way, and accordingly all those activities are needed to perform as and when the need arises. So controlling of the stock level, that is the inventory management, is essentially important. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have seen what is meant by the concept of aggregate planning in goods and services, how aggregate planning in goods and services is undertaken for the industry, and what are the various activities that are being performed under this scenario. And lastly, we have also seen the different types or the levels of strategy with respect to the aggregate planning in goods and services, and what is the impact of cost, product, and inventory under the concept of aggregate planning in goods and services. I hope you must have enjoyed your learning at this particular stage. We'll stay connected and tuned for the next lecture. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.